All right, well, let's get started. Good evening, everybody. My name is TJ Blakeman. I'm the president of the Champaign County History Museum. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to learn a little bit more about what we've accomplished in the past year and hear a terrific talk a little later. So the order today, just a little introduction, some ground rules. I'll do the state of the museum, and then Craig McGonigal will give us a great talk about photography, and we'll tie that in with the exhibit that we're about to open. So just a couple ground rules. Obviously, we can't afford the the fancy webinar version of Zoom, so we are just treating this as a meeting. And that means that if you have your camera on, I'll be able to see you along with all the other guests. But it also means that if you are eating dinner or blending something in a blender and you don't have your microphone muted, we will also hear that as well. So please do me a favor and mute your microphone, and we will have a section at the end for questions, and then we can unmute and ask any questions that you might have. But we'll try to keep it pretty tight and try to keep the extra sounds down as we move forward. So tonight, like I said, let me load up my screen here. And it's going to end up starting us right in the middle. There we go. Goodness. There we go. All right. So it is my pleasure to take a look back on what has turned out to be an unbelievably successful year. It certainly started out with a lot of questions, being closed due to COVID for over an entire year. But in May, we were able to reopen, and we have accomplished so much this year. Just for those of you who may be new to the organization, our mission statement is to discover, collect, preserve, exhibit, study, and interpret objects related to Champaign County history, and then to take those objects and provide educational programming about our heritage and the museum's collection. That's important because we collect objects. The archives, we have a terrific Champaign County archives, and there are other organizations that collect other pieces of our history, but it's our job to collect the three-dimensional objects and put those items on display and help educate the public about our history. That is all possible because we have a terrific board of trustees. Here are our members. Dolores Siebricht is our treasurer, Perry Morris, our vice president, Val Suslick, Hal Ballbeck, Alan Arnold, Joe Muskin, sorry, Joe, Andy Grote, Tim Mack, Rick Williams, Renee Potter, and Ian Wang. Without them, none of this would be possible. They're a terrific group of people who are not just policymakers, but also doers. And we ask a lot of our board members, and they continue to answer the call every time we ask. Just a second, I'm going to resize this. We also could not do this without our museum manager, who's on the call. Tom Kuipers has been such a terrific asset to this organization. He has helped us in so many ways, making new connections, getting so much done around this building. A lot of what I talk about today is directly related to the success he's had as our museum manager. This is him welcoming everyone back on our first day being open last May. One of the things that Tom was really instrumental in doing was bridging the divide and the gap between our institution and the University of Illinois. And with his help, we created a very robust intern program this year. We had 7 interns. I don't have a picture for one of them. A terrific group of people. I can't tell you how much they got done. And so we're really excited that this is a new pathway forward for getting so much done within our building, especially with our collections. The things that really matter, our collection inventory, our library, our vertical files, oral histories, digitizing exhibits, all of that was made possible because of our interns this year. So we want to say a big thank you to them. And we wouldn't be the museum we are without our volunteers. Unfortunately, I was looking through my collection of all these pictures of our volunteers, and I couldn't, for some reason, I haven't been taking many pictures. So I took a couple here, just some work in the popcorn wagon and other things around the building. I mean, from the maintenance of the building to operating the popcorn wagon to working our front desk and doceting, all the way up to really important collections work. Our volunteers have been the backbone of our workforce around here this year. So just a couple of those accomplishments in bullet form. Number one, we reopened in May with 3 brand new exhibits. I'll show you those in just a little bit. Thanks to the interns and Tom, we completely reorganized and indexed our entire library in vertical files. So all of our photos are now in one place in indexed folders, our family files, our vertical files, everything, every book in the library has been inventoried, the covers photographed, and all of that is now accessible to the public by searching the next bullet point, which is Champaign County History Online. I'll talk about this in just a little bit, but this was a huge step forward for the museum. We made significant popcorn truck repairs. We needed to spend a little time, a little tender loving care with our historic popcorn wagons. We did that this year. We launched brand new virtual exhibits. All the exhibits that we took down to replace, we actually created virtual exhibits. So now the public can literally, even if you had a virtual reality headset, could put that on and walk through the exhibit as though you're standing there. We celebrated the Virginia Theater's 100th anniversary and kind of our first step back into the public. I mentioned we have a renewed internship program, and we digitized more than 25 hours of oral histories this year. So I want to start first and foremost with what I think is one of the biggest steps forward the museum has taken maybe in its existence, and that is our Champaign County History Online portal. So thanks to our collection software, Past Perfect, we now have this online platform where you can search for objects in our collection using keywords. We have maybe a little bit more than 700 items of our 20,000 item collection that are now online. But like I mentioned, our library is now searchable, our vertical files, our photo files, our family files. So if you are interested in doing some research, you can check and see if we have something. And if we do, you can come in and take a look. Our museum collection, the thing that makes us what we are, had a couple of really great additions this year, and I wanted to highlight just a couple in particular. Maybe one of our biggest deliveries we've ever had. There's Perry Morris, our vice president. This was shipped to us from California after we made contact with a woman named Minchin Busey Moore. Her father was Matthew Wales Busey III, and when he passed away, this painting of Artemisia Busey was hanging in the family home. She reached out to us to see if we might have a place for it in our institution, and we couldn't turn it down, and so she mailed it to us from California. But the story doesn't end there, and by the way, she's hanging just over my right shoulder here in our community room. But the story doesn't end there because, of course, Matthew Wales Busey, one of the founders of Urbana, we had this painting on the left in our collection, which was donated by Clayton Overstreet, who you see standing there in the middle, who found this at an estate sale back in 2008. And he had it sitting in his house for a long time and had this huge tear down the middle. He bought it that way. He donated it to us. We thought, well, we might as well take it. We have no idea if it's ever going to get fixed, but we'll take it. And when we made connections with Minchin to talk about Artemisia, we said, hey, by the way, we have this painting of your great-great-great-great-grandfather, Matthew Wales Busey Sr., and it has this big tear. Is there anything, is there a way you might be interested? And of course, she said yes. And she said, if you send it to me here in San Francisco, I'll take it to the conservator I use and have the painting restored. And so we are so thrilled. We'll have we'll have a better story about this and how this all unfolded on our blog and in our newsletter sometime soon. But you can see hanging over my left shoulder is the restored Matthew Wales Busey painting, which was painted. The back said that this was painted in the 1840s. So it makes it one of the oldest objects in our collection. We've had some other terrific items walk in the door. This wonderful Sholem Shoes trophy that they won at the National Shoe Fair. This amazing collection of soapbox derby items from 1946, and a really wonderful collection of early WCIA Channel 3 artwork and some other items from the early days of WCIA. So I mentioned now that everything is searchable, you can actually go and look at those objects on our website. But if you find something of interest in our library, we hope you'll come in and see us. We have completely reorganized the library. We have set up a whole research station with a large flatbed scanner and a brand new, it's brand new to us, it's refurbished, but works like new microfilm scanner. And we now have a duplicate set of the News Gazette microfilms from the 1950s through the 2014, I believe. That was part of the collection we acquired last year from the News Gazette. And so now if we have a duplicate set that the archives also has, but if you'd like to do some research in our room and look at the News Gazette at the same time, you certainly can do that with our new digital microfilm reader and scanner. We have completely overhauled our lobby to be more welcoming, but also to increase our gifts and offerings. We hope that the gift shop will continue to be a larger and larger revenue stream and also an attractor to bring people in. We have stocked it with all new items of, we've got some housewares, we've got pillows, we've got tumblers, we've got our traditional books, postcards. We've really expanded our collection of the gift shop so that hopefully people it will bring you in the door, you'll spend money, but you'll also enjoy the museum while you're here. I mentioned we opened with 3 new exhibits. I'm going to run through those real quick, but I hope you'll actually come in and see them for yourself. The first one is an exhibit featuring the paintings of Marriage and Steve Kinigo. These were the paintings that we acquired in 2020 from the large collection of the News Gazette. And before we put them into deep storage, we thought it was interesting to put them on display and to focus on her artwork and how she was inspired by her villa in Italy. And so we have a great exhibit focused not only on the paintings, but also telling the stories of people from Champaign County and celebrities who all went to her villa and how interconnected she was with the celebrity world. Our next exhibit is the Illinois Traction System, William McKinley's Road of Good Service. This is a large exhibit featuring the Illinois Traction System, which spread across central and southern Illinois from the early 20th century for about 55 years. This absolutely changed the way our cities interconnected, the way we moved about, the way our goods and services were traded. And this exhibit goes in depth, taking a look at all the different facets and ways that the traction system had an impact on our lives, not only in Champaign County, but in large and small communities across central and southern Illinois. Our exhibit on Bob Zupke focuses on his sketch work. We also acquired during the News Gazette collection, but Zupke's collection is fascinating. It's from a trip that he took to Havana, Cuba. That's where the artwork comes from. But then we also dive in to learn more about Bob Zupke, not just the great All-American, a Hall of Fame football coach at Illinois, but all of the different facets of Bob's life. And then starting next week, now we had mentioned we'd hoped the exhibit would start tomorrow, but there were delays in the printing process for some of our work. And so we've had to push that 1 week. But Craig's going to talk about photography specifically to get to wet your whistle, to come in and take a look at our new exhibit, Snapshots, Champaign County Photography and Photographers 1851 to 1913. And Tom Kuipers, our museum manager, was asked if he could curate an exhibit for us. And we said, absolutely. And so Tom has done a great job of bringing this exhibit together, and it's in process. And I'm not going to show you any pictures from the build out of it. You're going to have to come see it, but we hope to open when we open next week. I mentioned another, we've been so cooped up, we have not been able to do our usual public events, which is a huge revenue source for us. It's a way we engage and get new members. And so we haven't had that opportunity, but I will mention one of those opportunities we most recently had was a chance to get the museum's name in front of a larger audience on the stage of the Virginia Theater, where Perry Morris and I went and did a history on the 100 years of the Virginia Theater. And we appreciate any of you that were at that event who are here tonight. We thought that went off without a hitch and a great way to start the 100-year celebration for the Virginia, which, if you get your tickets to the BAT, the official anniversary is December 28th, and you can go watch the show that the that the Virginia first opened with on December 28th, the bat. So our goals for 2022, I talked a lot about how vital Tom Kuipers has been to this institution, but unfortunately, well, fortunately for his family, who is moving to the Philadelphia area, it means we will lose our museum manager. So top on our goals in 2022, in February, when Tom leaves us, will be to hire a museum manager and hopefully be able to fill his shoes. We are planning to resume all of our public activities, including our history talks, our speaker series, history walks, which is our tours, history on the town, which is our thank you to all of our members, and hopefully some trivia nights. Those were very successful. We are planning to continue making improvements to the popcorn wagon, including a brand new kettle for the popcorn wagon. And big news recently, we haven't made this public, but a couple of big items have happened on our front. You may have noticed we've been asking for money to fix our roof for a while now. Well, we just had an anonymous donation come in about 2 weeks ago, $25,000 anonymous unrestricted donation with a simple gift to put it to good use. And at the same time, just earlier this Monday, we were approved, Champaign Rotary approved a Canon grant to our organization for $15,000 specifically to repair the roof. So among those two things, and hopefully the money that we're still hoping will come from the state of Illinois, we will be in a position in 2022 to make some huge steps forward for our facility, the cattle bank, the oldest building in Champaign, the oldest commercial building in Champaign County. It needs some work, and unfortunately, our budget does not handle those kinds of big projects. So this money now has been an unbelievable blessing to the museum, and we're looking forward to putting together the work plan and getting underway in the spring. We are also continuing to explore the museum's growth opportunities. We continue to grow the organization, and we want to continue to take it farther. We are having some early conversations about what that might look like, and we continue in 2022 to put that, to keep that conversation going, and hopefully we'll have something to bring to the members about those efforts. And then lastly, continuation of our collection digitization project. We've got 700 objects now. Hopefully with another slate of interns, we'll add another big chunk of our collection into the digital realm. And finally, next year is a party year for us. We celebrate 50 years as a museum next year. We started in 1972. And so we are looking forward to all of the ways that we will be able to bring some additional programming, some celebrations, some additional a look back at our own history. We're looking forward to bringing those to the community as well. So I have to end my portion on how can you help? Well, we are always asking for the same thing around here. We're asking for volunteers, and we're asking for memberships, and we're asking for donations. So we'll start with memberships. Many of you on this call are already members because our members are invited to vote here on our board, but some of you aren't. We would love to have you as members. We would love it if you would share with friends and family all of the great things that are happening at the museum and encourage them to join you in becoming a member. You can also gift a membership as a Christmas gift. So please keep those things in mind. Memberships are the lifeblood of our organization. They are what are enabling us to have staff. They are what pay the bills, aside from the big capital projects we have. And lastly, connect with us on social media. All of our platforms. I don't have Instagram up here. We're now on Instagram. We're on Twitter. We're on Facebook. Continue to visit our website, read our newsletter, read our stories, read the things that we put out there. We have done, Rachel, one of our interns, has been really active in social media this year, and it's really helped us to expand our reach. And so we're very pleased about that. All right, so that's the state of the museum. I have one business item for our members, and that is adoption of our slate of board candidates. And so members are allowed to vote non-members, we'd ask that you refrain from voting. These board seats are for 2-year terms, and Hal, Rick, Andy, Alan, Adele, and Ian are incumbents on our board. Ian is actually just filling out a vacated space that became vacated in the middle of a term. And we have one newcomer, Sarah Bennett, who is an archivist at the Champaign County Archives. We love having that strong connection between the archives and the museum. It's been very helpful. Tom has worked in both positions. Our former museum manager, Braden Belcher, and board member Braden Belcher, he was at the archives. So we've always had a good tie, and we want to continue that. So we're very happy to hopefully welcome Sarah on as one of our board members. So we do have to do this officially. I do need a motion from an active board member and a second from an active board member. So if anyone would like to make that motion, you can take yourself off mute and make that motion.
I make the motion, TJ. Renee Potter.
Renee Potter has made the motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Tim Mack has seconded it. I think I tried to make this easy where we have a poll and I can just launch this poll. Does everyone see a question just pop up?
Yes.
Okay. This gives you a chance to vote, and then we can actually take a number vote. So go ahead and do that now. And we'll close the voting here in just 30 seconds or so. Okay, I see things have kind of stopped there. We'll close the voting. The ayes have it, 17 yes, 0 no. I do appreciate you doing that. All right. Let me close out of my window here. All right. Now we'll move on to our actual program, what you all came here to see. You didn't necessarily come here to see me talk. Tonight we are excited to welcome Craig McGonigal, professor at Parkland College in photography. And like I mentioned, we're getting ready to open the exhibit. We felt it would be really great to have a little bit of walk down memory lane talking about photography. You know, I was looking for a stat the other day. I couldn't find it. I had a question. How many pictures do we take every day as a humankind? I think I looked that up and it was something like 8 billion pictures a day or something like that.
Especially in the digital age. Yes.
Exactly. I just think back, it's such an interesting transition from the day when you took a picture and you meant it, right? And so Craig's going to walk us back in time and talk about photography. And so I hope you will enjoy his talk. So I'm going to mute here and turn it over to Craig.
Okay, can everyone?
Hang on.
Sorry about that. I'm using a different computer, obviously. So let me do share screen, go to my PowerPoint. We have no sound, so I don't have to have sound shared. And okay, so everyone's seeing something? You got it? Okay, good. All right, so it was very interesting being asked to do this because I really don't have a great history of Champaign in my head, of photography in Champaign, and I do know it is very rich. And from what I've seen with the exhibition and talking with the curator, I learned quite a bit about what has gone on here, and it's pretty interesting. And I certainly think that you all absolutely need to come here and take a look at it. I have taught the history of photography for many years at Parkland before retiring 5 years ago. And I've also done presentations for other groups and such, and also taught classes with Ollie. So if you're not familiar with Ollie, I want to put in a little plug for them as well, that the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, I think I got that correct. It's been a couple of years since I've taught there, but they have fantastic class. And of course, the people who participate in it are absolutely fantastic. And if any of you, I recognized a couple of names earlier on that I think some people have been in my Ollie. So you're going to get a little bit of a repeat on things. So I'm going to cover a little bit of the history of photography. I'm not going much into the art because in Champaign, we didn't have a lot of artists working in the early years, and the exhibition goes through about 1913, if I remember correctly. So I go up to about that time period. And if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt and ask a question. I don't have the chat on, so I don't know if anybody is monitoring that, but if you monitor the chat someone, then I don't know if any of you are used to using chat, but certainly feel free to type into that. So when we go back to the history of photography, if we really want to go far back, I remember back in my days of taking classes on the history of photography, which I had taken multiple ones, that there was an Arab philosopher in a very early age that came up with some theories about how the eye worked and such. And so people like, oh, does it go back that far? And it's like, well, we do know that Leonardo da Vinci used what was called a camera obscura. And a camera is room and obscura is dark. And the phenomenon, I'm sure, was noticed much before that time period. But if you have a tiny hole, a pinhole, and then you have a darkened room so that the light comes through that tiny little hole, you can actually see that the pinhole acts as a lens, and you can actually see what is outside in the landscape. And I have seen it demonstrated in classes before, that there were artists who worked in that. But the best example I ever saw was I had a friend who had a tree branch that came down on his roof and poked a hole between the boards through the tar paper. And when he went up to check to see, what the attic was like, he was amazed that in there was the trees, beautiful green leaves, and the blue sky projected onto the walls. And he took a picture of that and he showed it to me, and I ended up getting a copy. And I would use that when I was doing my much longer lectures. So I don't have that included. But the history of photography itself goes back to the early 1800s, that we have three individuals, and I have them here, that are considered the fathers of photography. The first one is Nicephore Niepce. And I remember someone telling me that there's only like 3 people in the United States who can pronounce that name correctly. So I pronounce it as Niepce. Then there was Louis Jacques Monde Daguerre, and then William Henry Fox Talbot. Now, Niepce is sort of the first one amongst them to actually have some success with creating a photographic image. And we have an example of it. Let's see. Okay, I got to use it down here. It's been a while since I've been on a Zoom and had to use a PowerPoint. There we go. So the image on the left that you see is a work that was created by Kodak from the plate on the right. That when you look at that plate on the right, you would just probably throw it away. It's got some dents in it, and there's some smudges on it. But they were able to recreate that image on the left side. And for many years, the one that I saw on the left, that was the only image I ever saw of what that first image created by Niepce was, what it looked like. And he used a strange compound that is kind of a precursor to asphalt, that it was based on sort of tar. And this is an exposure out his window of something like 8 hours to create onto this pewter plate that you see on the right. And I had the opportunity many years ago in one of the conferences that I went to visit the museum in Austin, Texas, I believe is where it's at now, that they have that particular plate. And it's amazing that it's lasted this long, because over the years, it's passed through many hands, that nobody ever threw it away. but somehow they managed to keep it going and saying that this is the original first photograph. And looking at that plate, you can just barely make out the image, but on the left, you can see in the far distance, there's some trees, you can see some towers, the building. And an interesting story that the Nipsfjord Nep's house is now a museum. And a few years back, they tried to recreate the picture out the window that they thought was used. And they couldn't do it, that the photograph just did not look the same. And it turned out that in the entire house, that was the only window that had been replaced and moved. And so it was in a different location. So then they had to remodel just that portion of the house, and then they were able to actually recreate that photograph. So Niepce was working a bit on the photographic process, and Daguerre started working on trying to figure out a way to do the photographic process. And between the two of them, they were using the same person for their cameras and lenses. That camera obscuras, if you ever saw the movie Girl with the Pearl Earring, which is about Vermeer, and he uses a camera obscura, and so that was in Antwerp, I think, in the 1400s, 1500s. I don't remember the date of that particular one, but she looks at the camera obscura, and he would use it for drawings, and there was a glass plate on there, and she looked down and she could see the room being projected and was kind of freaked out by that. So camera obscuras were around and were being used by artists, and they wanted them, however, to try to capture in a different way that image than drawing. That Daguerre and Niepce both weren't very good artists, so they wanted to try to capture it some other way. Well, using that same camera creator, they went back and forth, and the guy said, "Hey, Daguerre, do you know that Niepce is doing the same sort of thing?" And he's, "No, I didn't know that." And then he said the same thing to Niepce, "Do you know Daguerre is doing that?" So Daguerre reached out to Niepce and started up a correspondence with him, and they eventually partnered. But unfortunately, Niepce died before they made any real progress photographically. Daguerre, however, playing around with iodine and using silver plates, that he would take a copper plate and plate it with silver. Then he would expose it to some chemicals and try to capture an image. And so you have here one of the first images that he captured out his window of Paris. And it was a very interesting way that he actually discovered the process that worked. That if you sensitize the plate with one chemical and then develop it with a different chemical, you actually get an image. And so it was sort of the discovery of the latent image, or what is in film before it is developed. Daguerre discovered it completely by accident. He had been experimenting and he'd been able to come up with some sort of images, but they would continue to darken and darken and darken, and he wouldn't have anything after several days of after having exposed the plates. Well, one day it was time for dinner. He had exposed a plate all day, didn't have time to mess around with the chemicals, so he stuck it in a cabinet and then went to dinner. The next day, when he opened up the cabinet, took out the plate, it had an image on it like he had never seen, that it was a true photographic image, that it was just a wonderful thing. And he knew there was something in that cabinet that caused it to develop. Well, he experimented, took everything out of the cabinet, one by one, tried the different things, and he discovered that the fumes from a broken thermometer that was mercury actually developed the plate. So he was able to then refine that process of using iodine fumes to sensitize the plate and then use mercury fumes to develop the plate. Well, as you know, mercury isn't the best thing to actually have, especially fumes in as a photographer, or for anyone. And as time went on, people were constantly looking at other ways to actually make a way to create photographs. And so luckily, by the 1850s, daguerreotypes had sort of disappeared. In the exhibit, you will see some daguerreotypes. And one of the things is that there's extreme amount of detail in it. If you think about it, that this is the actual piece that was in the camera, that every daguerreotype is unique. So looking at it, you are looking at what the photographer saw, but it has a very metallic mirror-like image to it. And if you look at the daguerreotype from the wrong angle, all you see is a reflection. So within the exhibit, you kind of have to move back and forth a little bit, but you'll be able to see some great details in the daguerreotypes that are in the exhibit. Now, about the same time, actually around 1826, that remember 1839 is when we say the birth of photography is, around 1826, Henry Fox Talbot was working in England, and he was playing with silver salts and coating paper with it. But unfortunately, his results were always negative images. So on the right side, you see a negative image, and on the left side, you see a positive image. So he was able to create images, but he was not able to have them last, that they would, as time goes on, the paper would continue to darken, because in all those white areas on the right, there were still the silver salts that were darkening, that were tarnishing when the light strike it. So we do have some examples of his very early ones that have been kept in darkened places. And I had the opportunity up in Chicago one time in an exhibit, walking around, I saw a piece of black felt on the wall down in the photography gallery. And I was like, well, that's kind of odd. And then I walked over and looked, and there was a label on it, and you were to lift up the black felt because they didn't want the light to continue to darken the image. So Henry Fox Talbot was playing around with it, and this is actually the true precursor to photography, because of the fact that you started off with a negative image, and then much later he determined that if he wet the paper, or if he dipped it in wax, that it would become more transparent, and then he could put it on another piece of paper with silver salts and then create a positive image. But he wasn't sure about that, because again, they continued to sort of darken. But he had a friend, Sir John Herschel, who said, why don't you try using salts? And so he ended up using salt to fix the image and create the image once he had a positive that would be around for a long time. However, Daguerre is really the one that got photography going. That Daguerre, Niepce had died, Daguerre came up with his process, and he went in front of the Scientific Society in Paris, and he spoke to the society, and he listed exactly how to make a daguerreotype. Take a copper plate, coat it with silver, polish the silver. Then you take iodine fumes, heat up iodine, and expose the plate to that. You put it into a camera obscura, you expose it, and then after a long exposure, then you develop it with mercury fumes, and then you have the image. Talbot, his process was a little simpler, but you see here we have him exposing through the paper other pieces of paper to create his positive images. But Daguerre's images had so much more detail to them that he immediately went and told that society in August of 1839 how to do the process, and people ran from his lecture and went to the guys who made cameras, went to the chemists and bought the chemicals and started setting up and doing it. So within weeks, there were photographers who were actually able to reproduce what he had done. And the one thing about Daguerre is when he did that, he said, anyone in the world can use it, except the English, because he didn't particularly like the English because they had had a few wars. So you had to pay, if you lived in England, you had to pay him. But Henry Fox Talbot, once he read the newsprint about how Daguerre had come up with his process, he's like, well, wait a minute, I've had this around for more than 10 years. 1826, I had an image. So he actually started telling about his process, but anyone who wanted to use his process had to pay him royalties. So that was an interesting kind of thing that he sort of shot himself in the foot, because the daguerreotype, only the English had to pay a royalty. So everyone was out there doing it. And because it was a much more photographic representation, many more people were actually out there doing it. We have lots of literature that goes out around the world that within a very short time, it had been translated how to make a daguerreotype in something like 40 different languages. And it pretty much circumvented the globe within a couple of years, that there were people all around the world doing daguerreotypes. And as people experimented with it, and they experimented with other chemicals, they helped to improve the process. And here you have how long it would typically take to expose plates at different hours of the day. And so, and what kinds of daytime weather you might have, whether it was brilliant and clear or hazy, or if there was snow on the ground, all that type of thing were all taken into account. And then how many minutes it would take at particular hours of the day. So you can see that it could take 15 minutes or 25 minutes or 50 minutes, depending on how cloudy or bright the day was. And this is actually something that, as photography continued and we had some other changes in the processes, that I always get my mouse in the wrong place. I have to keep moving my cursor. But as time goes on, you know, that there are improvements that other chemicals are beginning to use. And here we see some ambrotypes and daguerreotypes. Now, a daguerreotype, as I said, looks like a mirror. An ambrotype is something that is put onto glass. And in the exhibit downstairs, you will see some ambrotypes as well. And it's kind of hard sometimes to actually identify them, that sometimes they even look like a tintype. In a tintype, they have put the emulsion, or what captures the image, directly onto a metal plate. They were other people who were experimenting with other things. And one of the things that was experimented with was wet collodion. And collodion was actually a byproduct of gun cotton. And gun cotton is an explosive that was being used for cannons and for guns and things like that. And this was a byproduct of that. So it wasn't the best thing, but you know, people had tried it, and they discovered that they could actually, doctors began using it to close wounds. So you may have heard of them using a super glue today to close a wound. Well, they were using wet collodion back in the 1840s to sort of protect wounds that were open. And because it would stick to skin, someone decided, hey, let me try that on glass. And they put the wet collodion onto glass. And then they said, hey, that will stick to it. What if I put the silver salts into that and make it susceptible to light? And so that's where ambrotypes and tintypes came from, because eventually people said, hey, I can't get any glass. What else can I use? So they started using tin because it was quite available. And so tin was coated with this wet collodion and then put into a camera, and pictures were taken. And again, time goes on and they begin to sort of change the process somewhat. But it was a lengthy process. And actually, when they discovered that they could put it onto glass, they figured out that, hey, we can do what Henry Fox Talbot was doing and create a negative image. And then we can use Henry Fox Talbot's paper to create a reproduction of it. So we went from having tintypes being unique images and wet collodion on glass to make an ambrotype, to wet collodion alone making a negative image to recreate more photographs, because we could take the photographic paper, expose it through sunlight through the glass, and then continue on and make 10, 20, 30, as many photographs as we wanted to make from that same particular image. When you look at these pictures here, I picked this particular one because it had some of the most interesting, that these are what we call occupational photographs, that we have a blacksmith, we have a carpenter. I'm not sure what that guy is doing down in the bottom. It might be shoes. I think he might be creating shoes. and then probably a doctor or someone. I can't quite see what he has. It might be, it's been a long time since I've looked at the slide, so you have to forgive me for not knowing exactly what those guys are doing. But as time goes on, even with daguerreotypes, we begin to see people putting that camera to use doing all kinds of things. We have microscopes, and they would put a camera onto it. And so by 1844, only 5 years after the daguerreotype process was already circumventing the world, we have them putting it onto a microscope, and we have the cells of a frog's blood. We had surgeries that were taken, so medical photography. So Southworth and Hawes were well-known photographers in Great Britain, and they took a picture of a first operation using ether in 1847. So we had medical photography going on. James Whipple attached one to a camera. Attached a camera to a telescope. And you have to remember that the light that strikes the moon is the same as the light that strikes the earth at noon. So if we go back to our table, you will see that it's not that long of an exposure for a daguerreotype taking a picture of the moon. However, it still is several minutes. So one of the things that he would have to use is some sort of clockwork mechanism so that he tracked the moon in order to get the nice clear picture. And the details, I mean, if you look at this image, that if you were to take a microscope and look at that image, you would clearly see the craters, even greater detail with that daguerreotype, because it is, quite large image that is created and gets all of those details. We had street photography that was being done. Now, when we say street photography, we mean people out on the street, obviously. But if you look carefully at this picture by Negre, you will note that the feet are all flat on the ground, except for one boy, and they are not actually moving. So it is probably a 5-minute exposure in the middle of the day in order to get that picture at that time. The boy in the front, you can see his head is a little blurry. And it's probably because his foot wasn't that steady, having the heel up like it is. A little bit morbid, but people wanted portraits, and they wanted to have pictures of the things that they knew and loved. And of course, the child mortality rate in the 1800s was quite high. And so we have a great many post-mortem pictures or after death pictures that were taken. And it got to be such a major part of photography studios that there were cities began to pass laws that you could not transport a dead body to a photographer because it just wasn't healthy. So at least they figured that part out. We have Roger Fenton, who went to, well, it's kind of in the middle of the news again, but over there between Russia and the Ukraine, we had the Crimean War, and then the British were involved in it. Now, because the process did take so long to take a picture, we don't have any photographs of war actually happening. It was always the aftermath of war. And for the longest time, the Crimean War and Roger Fenton taking those pictures was thought to be the first pictures of war. But since then, we have discovered that there are some photographs of some American soldiers down in Mexico. There's, I think, like 3 images, one of a general and one of an amputee, and I can't remember what the third one is. So we'd have some precursors to the Crimean War. What you see here is the Valley of Death. And if you're at all familiar with Lord Tennyson, he wrote a poem about the Valley of Death, the Charge of the Light Brigade. Into the Valley of Death rode the 500. So you may recall those words. And essentially what it was is that a cavalry troop went up against cannons, and they were decimated by the cannon fire that was pointed at them. And we see in this picture, it wasn't actually that Valley of Death, but a different Valley of Death. where the British were constantly taking their supplies up and down this road, and the Russians knew where they were going to be, and they were constantly shooting cannons over the hills into this particular roadway. And all of those round balls that you see are cannonballs. And obviously they've cleaned up the rest of the mess, the bodies, etc. But this was considered the Valley of Death by the soldiers who were in the Crimea at that time. Henry Peach Robinson, that this is 1858. And by this time we have the wet collodion process as a negative. It was a laborious process, that I said earlier, that what you had to do was you had to take a glass plate, you had to polish it, you had to coat it with collodion, sensitize it, and put it into a camera obscura, take a picture before it dried, then take it into another darkened area and develop the image. So early studio photography wasn't so bad because you could have your darkroom there. Roger Fenton out on the battlefield, well, his little wagon that he used to create his plates and then take the photographs became a target, as did the ones during the Civil War of photographers, because they thought they were munitions. But Henry Peach Robinson, that this particular image is created using 5 separate negatives. If you look at the curtain next to the gentleman that's looking out the window, that the elderly woman on the left is a separate negative from the gentleman standing in the center, is a separate image to the woman that is on her deathbed, is separate from the image of the other woman, which is separate from the window image, because they could not get an image where outside would be the same as photographing inside, that the amount of time. So he created this image using 5 different negatives. And, you know, people just were fascinated by the fact. So we had Photoshop, in a sense, back when he created this in 1858. So quite fascinating that within a short time, we had aerial photography by 1860 with a gas balloon and having a camera on there. And you can see that the image is not a real sharp image, and it's simply because the gas balloon would be moving with the wind. But this is Boston, taken by James Black from a gas balloon. So just about any type of process or a genre of photography, another image by Roger Fenton, a still life, was taken within 10, 15 years of photography being invented. And they discovered that if you had 2 images side by side, that if you just separated a camera, either by having 2 lenses on it or moving the camera 2.5 inches, you could recreate a stereoscopic image. You can see what appears to be a 3D image. And it's why our eyes see 3D, is because of that separation, which is approximately 2.5 inches. It will vary from person to person, obviously. But Oliver Wendell Holmes came up with the first stereoscopic viewer. We had daguerreotypes that were stereoscopic, that had little viewers that were attached to them. And in the exhibit downstairs, you will see that there are several tabletop stereo viewers that you can actually walk up to and see these images. And they became a very popular form of entertainment because, of course, we had no radio, television, TV, phonographs, CDs, or anything like that. So people would buy these sets of stereo cards and then sit around and pass around the viewer and look at Jerusalem and Israel and Pakistan, Afghanistan, China, Japan. You know, the whole world was opened up to people by photographers going around and creating these stereo cards. And that process went on from the early 1840s on up through, you know, well, people are still creating stereoscopic images today, but if you remember, probably as a child like myself, the Viewmaster was a stereo viewer, that it was movie film that was used to create those types of things. So stereo viewers, you know, people are still creating that. And now we're into 3D, with virtual helmets, putting those on and seeing it. But you know, the one thing that what we have happening in Champaign is that from what I was told, that we had photographers coming to Champaign very early on in the late 1840s, early 1850s, I think it was. And you'll have to look at the exhibit and talk to the people downstairs, but they can tell you exactly when photographers started photographing here in Champaign. And as I said earlier, that it was translated, the daguerreotype process was translated into 40 different languages within the first year and had spread around the world. Samuel Morse brought the process to America. Matthew Brady learned it from Samuel Morse, and Samuel Morse is the one who came up with the telegraph for Morse code and the telegraph. And he was very much interested in science, and he taught Matthew Brady how to create daguerreotypes. And Matthew Brady, whose name is probably familiar to most of you, is known for his Civil War images that he created. But he had studios in Washington, D.C., in New York, and I believe in Philadelphia. And he photographed many, many famous people of the time. That he photographed something like every president from, I want to say, Jackson on up through the 1880s, every president. Obviously, Jackson was not president at the time that he was photographed, but you know, Brady is known for that. His portraits of Lincoln are very well known, and if you look at a $5 bill, you will see a portrait by Brady that was used to make that engraving on the $5 bill. So portraiture was really what the majority of photographers began to do. And one thing that was brought up about the Champaign photographers is they seem to have only been around for a short time before they moved on. And part of it was that at the time that they began photographing here, I think the population was around 3,000. And the process was not cheap. It wasn't very expensive, you know, especially by today's standards, 25 cents doesn't seem that expensive, but you know, that was a lot of money at the time. And so you had photographers who would come in, photograph anybody who wanted to be photographed, and then they move on. That they either set up a studio outside, had a tent to do their processes, or they rented a building for a short while that had good windows. Here you can see that this is how a wet collodion photographer would work. That you see all the chemicals inside in a darkened tent. You have an assistant who did all the process, handed to the photographer. The photographer put the plate in the camera, exposed the plate for the 5 minutes that were required, give it back to the assistant who would run inside the tent and develop it before it dried. So you can imagine that, you know, depending on the weather, it would be a very cumbersome type of process to try to complete before it dried and then the plate was useless. And because it was such a lengthy process, this is not a torture or execution device, that those clamps were used to hold people's heads in place for the amount of time that it would take to make a picture. And then you can see on the left side, a typical type of camera. And this particular camera, this is an old drawing, and I've seen it in multiple places, and nowhere does it explain that particular camera. And I believe that the camera is actually backwards from where the person would be sitting. So I think that these are actually two different illustrations put side by side. That on the back of the camera, you can see that there's what looks like a 4-paned window that they would put one plate in, and then there would be 4 lenses. You can see 2 that are poking through the one side, that they would have 4 lenses, and they would uncap each lens for either a different pose or uncap them all to take 4 pictures at the same time, and then sort of speed up the process of then being able to reproduce the prints for the client. So the camera that you will see downstairs is not quite like this, but it is very similar, that you have this large table-like thing that the camera sits on that is used to position it in the right place so that the picture could be taken. Here we see some illustrations of how to create the perfect studio. So you can see that skylights were very important. You can see that up in the upper picture, there is a screen that would be pulled in and out, that you have props down below in the studio, with the illustration on the very bottom that you could see that they used mirrors to help bring more light in. And where you see the letter B stands for the blue bottles, as well as being part B of the drawing. But they were blue bottles because blue light helped to expose the plates much easier. That the film at the time was not sensitive to all colors of light, that they were orthochromatic, and as time went on, eventually we came up with panchromatic film. And then we have some photographs of an actual studio in the 1880s, probably. And you can see on the left side that there are curtains at the top that light could come through and give a nice soft sort of glow to the person. And then on the right side, you can see that they could control the amount of light, and then all of the props and the furniture, et cetera, that they had over stored on the right side. So photographers up until the early 1900s, and actually after the 1900s, many photographers continued to use only natural lighting to create their images, because there was no lighting that would actually give them the results they wanted. That gas lighting was way too dim, and actually it was marketed photographic papers. You could develop them by gaslight, that they weren't too sensitive, that you could not use gaslight to actually see what you were doing when you created them. And so that's how a lot of photographers developed using gaslight. So there's gaslight papers. But if it was a snowy day or a rainy day or overcast day, well, the photographer was out of business for the day. So during the day, it was nice, bright, sunny. Hey, run over to the photographer, get your picture taken, because that was the time to get it done. This is the typical staff that a studio photographer would have in 1900. And you can see that, well, we don't quite have the child labor laws yet. They come a little bit later. So we have young girls who are working, that they were often retouchers, that they had red in the cheeks, a little blue in the eyes. They would retouch the negatives by either, I hope, are you guys all seeing this? I saw my internet connection was unstable. I hope you're seeing my image. But they would scratch the negatives and cut out parts that weren't wanted or needed. Down at the bottom there, you can see the racks that were used to dry the prints. From the right, rather, the second one from the right are mounted prints that the glues would have been used to attach the photographs to cards. So you have cabinet cards, you have carte de visites, which the carte de visite was an invention by a French photographer. And of course, right now, his name is escaping me, but he figured out that if he made tiny photographs, that people could use them as visiting cards. So they became known as carte de visites. So when you see small 2-inch by 3-inch pictures on a card, those are carte de visites. And then cabinet cards were what people would display on their in their dining rooms, on cabinets, etc. And so those are closer to 5 by 7 in size. So behind the boy in the back, you can see some examples of their images in different sizes. You can see the different size cameras that they had. You have the photographer, the chemists. So you have all of them. In the very center there, that large box with a funnel, not the funnel, rather the smokestack on top, that was actually the safe light that was used. And then you have the chemicals in the bottles. And so you'll see similar things to that, again, all in the exhibit downstairs. So it's very wonderful, the things that they were able to get together. So here I have one of my final images. I have one more after this. That this is a picture that was taken by Edward Steichen in 1903 of J.P. Morgan. And if you know the name J.P. Morgan, you may remember that he was one of the robber barons, and he was considered to be a very ruthless person. And if you look in this particular picture, that Steichen was commissioned to make the photograph, and he created this photograph. And it was later people were like, oh yeah, that's J.P. Morgan. Look at him. He's got a knife in his hand to stab him in the back and twist it. Well, the reality is that is the chair arm that he has his hand on, and it is not a knife. But it never got away from that being called a knife that is in his hand, especially with that dour look on his face. But this would have been taken with natural lighting by Edward Steichen, and just creating this wonderful portrait. So I wanted to include at least one last portrait. And then as a final image, this is the gentleman, George Eastman, who came up with the film camera that amateurs began to use. And you will see some amateur cameras downstairs. But he is the one who really made photography open to the masses. You know, the people who were doing photography up to this time period were mostly wealthy people, or they were professional photographers who were creating the images up to this time. And Eastman figured out a process on how to make roll film with early celluloid. And his first cameras would have 100 exposures in them. So you could take 100 pictures. And if you note, this picture is round because his first camera used the entire image from the lens, and the lens throws a round image. But we typically, with your digital camera or your cell phone now, we just see a rectangular part that is only the center of the image. And the large cameras that are used, they could be moved around that circle of the image. That there are reasons for doing that. A studio photographer would know that you can move it and change things, perspective, etc. But Kodak, he just made the very simple camera of that lens open with a quick flip of the lever, created the picture. It snapped. It was a snapshot. We got that name. It was taken from hunting. And then we got other words like shooting that come from hunting. So it became almost a kind of violent kind of sport that there are stereo cards. I have one of a guy who is breaking into a woman's bedroom, and she's got a blanket up around her nose. He says, "Don't be scared. I'm not a Kodak fiend." That became a name for the time because people with Kodaks were constantly taking pictures of other people. And he says, "Don't worry, I'm just a burglar. I'm not a Kodak fiend." And so that was sort of how things started happening, that studios are still popular today because there is something that is needed to create continuously a wonderful portrait. And downstairs, you will see the early ones here in Champaign that created those wonderful portraits that many people still have in their family albums. They may not remember them, but many people do have the labels on them. That's great-great-grandma or great-grandma or grandma that was taken by a particular studio here in Champaign. So that is about as far as I'm going to take you. So I decided that I would end around the early 1900s because that is how our exhibit was. But I don't know, I may teach another Ollie class someday, so you can keep your eye out. But I haven't taught the history of photography in quite a while. So it was a real pleasure being able to sort of share my knowledge again with you. So I will stop my share now. And then were we going to open the questions in general, or?
Yeah, why don't you use that and then come
Okay.
around here and all right, well, Craig's gonna come around and we'll take questions together, both on his presentation and mine. But before we do that, I want to give Tom a chance. Tom was the one that put our exhibit together. And so I thought I'd give him a chance to say a few words about the exhibit that you're going to see that will open up next week. So Tom, any comments, any thoughts?
Sure. First and foremost, I want to thank Craig for such a wonderful talk. That was absolutely fascinating. Those are just some amazing pictures you showed, and just your knowledge of the history of photography is just amazing. And I was truly interested the entire time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And of course, me having researched this exhibit over the past few months and putting it together, I've learned a lot about photography myself. So I was able to understand maybe some of the things about the chemicals and other things you were talking about that maybe others didn't. So I really appreciated the kind of providing that perspective as well. But so yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure to put together this exhibit. I've always thought photography and just the visual culture and things like that are super fascinating in our society. I'm also really excited that I was able to show some photography from some areas of Champaign County that aren't necessarily always covered. You know, we have some photos from Frank Sidoris, of course, Sidoris, and Frank Rice of St. Joseph. And he also photographed Glover and places like that. And then we have the Everett Block collection. And those are photos of Sydney and, you know, Mayview and all these other places. So I'm really excited that we're able to show so much more of the county and just kind of really represent everything. I really hope that you have an opportunity to come and check out the exhibit. We will definitely have it up by next week. And I will be around for a little while if anybody has any questions about it. I'll be happy to answer them. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure to work for the Champaign County History Museum. I am not excited to leave, but I'm excited for the future that is ahead of me. I will do my best. I will certainly keep in touch, and I hope to remain a part in some way, always, of the Champaign County History Museum. I'm sure I've left my mark in the catalog and around the building well enough. So, so thank you to everybody. Thank you to the Board of Trustees. Thank you to all our interns. Thank you to our volunteers, and just thank you all for being here today.
Well, Tom, if we were all in one big room, we would give you a huge round of applause. I want to thank you again. You will always be part of our museum family, and you'll always have a place to bring your little growing family back to visit over the years. So yeah, Tom is also a new dad, and so we want to wish Vera and Tom all the best on their future endeavors. All right, so with that, we will open it up to any questions. Any questions about the museum? I'm happy to answer. Any questions about photography? I'm gonna let Craig answer those. And so let's just, if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself. We'll try to, we have multiple ones, we'll try to take them in order. Any questions out there?
Hi, this is Edie Erdman. I was interested in what kind of paint did they use when they painted on the tin types or then paper?
Well, I actually have a few different things in my house that when Tom came by, he saw the different things that I have. They used oils mainly, but they did use watercolors. Kodak made some sheets of paper that if with a watercolor, with water, you would just sort of like pick up the colors and then coat onto the papers. Today we have Marshall's oils is the most popular product. And you can still purchase those. I'm not sure if the company is still around, but you can, I just looked on eBay a couple of months ago for a friend that I knew that was interested in trying some hand coloring. Very early on, the Daguerreotypes, the one thing with the Daguerreotype is that it is a very fragile image. So what they did with the Daguerreotypes is they actually used a straw and blue powders. And I have a couple of images in books that I have seen that it's just fascinating that they look like a color image with reds and yellows and greens and blues in the area. And they must have used a very small straw. They probably used originally straws to create and blow pigments onto them. But the majority, once it started happening later, the majority of things are oils. Even some gold paints and brass paints were used to like put buttons on people. So it's a whole variety of things. I myself have done things even using crayons that when I was an undergraduate, I did a series of images where I was using crayons on it. So anything that will stick to the emulsion is something to use.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, I have another one. I have old, I think they're tin types from like a boardwalk with the men Earl in their old swimming suits. So were there photographers that would go to the ocean, the beach?
Yes.
How would that work?
Well, tintypes, from the moment that it started in the 1850s, if I remember correctly, 1855, I think is when it started, on up through today, people are still doing tintypes because it is an interesting process that has a certain look to it. And the materials are not that expensive. Of course, chemicals are getting more expensive, but they would pretty much do what I showed the picture of, the having the tent and having to coat the materials. I do believe that now you can buy some that are manufactured tintypes. So they have improved the processes somewhat. So probably on boardwalks and such, they probably aren't creating them as they did originally, but are just buying the process and buying things, or creating them in their own darkroom using formulas and then drying them and then taking them to wherever they're photographing.
Seems
Thank
like
you.
all good entrepreneurs would want to be where the people are.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Festivals, fairs, boardwalks, that kind of thing. Any other questions? I have a quick one. I was always under the impression that when people saw the first photographs, they were actually scared of them because they had never seen someone's likeness reflected back in that way.
Well, you know, you may be slightly confusing it with cinematography,
Could be.
because
yeah.
with cinematography, when
A
the
movie picture.
first moving picture was of a train approaching the camera, and the people that were watching it apparently jumped out of their seats because here is this train being projected toward them. I have not come across anything that said that people were scared of them, and certainly there were painters who could paint photographically, as we
So
say
real,
today, you know, much like Billy Morrow Jackson's
Yeah.
images that we have one here in the boardroom, there were always painters like that. And then of course there were painters who were not. So, but to have the details in them, and actually there was a painter by the name of Oscar Rylander, who was a fabulous painter, and he quit painting because when he saw his first photograph, that looking at the folds of the cloth, he's like, there's no way I could paint anything like that. And so he became a photographer, and became a photographer for the Queen and King of England, or actually it was a king, Prince Albert. So the Queen of England and Prince Albert were huge proponents for photography and bought many photographs from different people and had them created for them and their family. And Oscar Rylander photographed their family quite a bit. So
My last question, I don't mean to jeopardize. When Abraham Lincoln had his picture taken at Oshuler's in Urbana, do you suspect that they would have used the contraptions to hold his body still in that pose, or where were they at in that process?
if I remember, I think it was a daguerreotype, wasn't it, that was done?
I think so, and Tom might know the specific answer to that question.
I remember him
It
telling
was an Ambrotype. It was an
It was
Ambrotype.
an Ambrotype. So an Ambrotype, yeah, the exposure would have probably been a couple of minutes. So there is a good chance that they did have, and by that time, they probably weren't really clamping it down. It was probably
Just a
just
rest.
you know, this is
Head
so you know
rest.
where to be,
Yeah.
and that's where you're sitting. And that is one reason when you see old photographs that people are not smiling, because sometime if you want to try it, sit there and hold a smile for 5 minutes and see if you can do it. I had gone to a lecture where someone had created a modern day pinhole camera and was photographing people, and he told them all, he says, you know, don't smile, just sit there and just look at the camera. I'll be back in 10 minutes. And one guy was like, oh, I can hold a smile for 10 minutes. And he showed us the photograph, and it was very scary looking, you know, by the end of the picture, because the guy had just trying to hold that, you know.
A little too big of a smile.
Yeah.
All right, well, any last questions? Well, before we wrap up, I do have one quick announcement. On Friday, I think, is it 1 o'clock? Maybe one of the other board members will correct me. At the Champaign County Courthouse, there is an event that you would all be welcome to. It's the unveiling of a new exhibit on Judge J.O. Cunningham, and the Lincoln Legacy Committee is putting that together. And I just mentioned that because over my right shoulder, we have a small exhibit on Judge Cunningham as well. We actually have his top hat in our collection. And so we brought that out. And in fact, in this room, what we've tried to do with our community room here on the second floor is display some of what we would consider to be our most notable artifacts. And so we've got some really large paint, the Billy Morrow Jackson painting on the wall, the Artemisia painting, the Summer Compass, which is from the 1850s, the Civil War sword. Those are the kind of things we're trying to bring out in this room. So if you visit, make sure you come up to the second floor to see not only this, but our exhibit in the hallway. So with that, we will call it a day. And I hope that you all will help us spread the great message of what's going on inside the Cattle Bank. And I'm certain that 2022 will be another fantastic year for us. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for spending this hour and a half with us tonight. And we will be posting this online. And so if you want to share it with friends and help spread the message, we certainly would appreciate that. But with that, we'll call it a night. And I want to thank you all once again for coming. Have a good evening.
Thank you, TJ.